Hello everyone and welcome to APS webinars. Before we get started, I want to remind you all that if you want to hear about other APS webinars, to please sign up for our mailing list. You can sign up by visiting the URL that's visible on your screen, www.aps.org/careers/guidance/webinars. The title of today's presentation is Launching Your Career with Industry Postdocs. I'm Crystal Bailey and I'll be your host for today's broadcast. Thank you all so much for joining us. APS webinars are brought to you as a service of the American Physical Society, connecting you with the expertise of individuals who can offer insight into physics careers, educational programs, and professional development for students, working physicists, and educators. As you can see on your screen, today's webinar is being recorded, and everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording. It'll come about 24 hours from now. After our speaker finishes the presentation, the remainder of the program, the last half of the program, will belong to you for our question and answer session. Because of the number of people attending this webinar, we are only accepting text questions. So if you have questions during the broadcast, please ask them in the question box located on your screen, and we'll try to get to all of them at the end of Ray's presentation. Lastly, we encourage you to complete the survey upon exiting so that APS webinars can improve its ability to provide you with these valuable services. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Today's speaker is Ray Beausoleil with Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Ray leads the large-scale integrated photonics research group and is responsible for research on the applications of optics at the micro-nanoscale to high-performance classical and quantum information processing. Ray received his Ph.D. in physics from Stanford and has spent 20 years as a member of the technical staff at HP Laboratories. He has published over 300 papers and conference proceedings and 5 book chapters, and has also over 115 patents issued with over 3 dozen pending. He has also hired and worked with dozens of recent Ph.D. graduates as industry postdocs at HP Enterprise. Ray is an APS Fellow and is also the 2016 recipient of the Distinguished Lectureship on the Applications of Physics Award. Ray, take it away.
Thanks very much, and thanks to you who are joining us today. I'm going to talk to you about why you should consider beginning your career with a postdoc in industry. Just for context, and I'll show you a picture of my team later and be a little more concrete about it. Right now I have approximately 18, maybe 19 full-time regular employees working for me, and only 3 of those did not come to me first as postdocs. So 15 of the people who are currently working for me began their careers with me as my postdoc. So I'll try to bring you a broad perspective, but I admit that a lot of the alleged insights I'm going to provide for you are tied to my own experience with industrial postdocs. And so first, let's just briefly begin with a few comments about why it is that companies like mine even bother with postdocs. Why do we do it? I'd say one of the most important consideration is recruitment. Being able to bring someone in and train them as a postdoc will dramatically, in my experience, improve the connection between people and jobs, so that generally the job that we hire someone to do initially as a postdoc is not the job we will necessarily hire them for once their postdoc is complete if they choose to remain with us. And so as a result, it significantly improves the fit of candidates to not just those jobs, but careers, which I think is a big benefit to us as well as to the candidate. Very often we'll recruit postdocs to do exploratory research beyond the scope of an existing program. And that's often in the context of external contracts, which I'll mention in just a bit. It allows us to form a bond with certain academic programs with professors that we think are very well aligned with the R&D that we do in the company. And so for us, getting to know professors at the universities we hire postdocs from is in fact one of the rewards of opening up our company to postdocs in the first place. Postdocs inevitably and wonderfully bring with them tremendous enthusiasm and the ability to innovate, and that kind of new blood is incredibly important to a stodgy old company like ours. And I'm 58 years old, and so talking to someone half my age tends to be very invigorating, and helps me see opportunities that I would not have seen if I were just talking to myself, for example. We will very often in my team hire postdocs to perform, give them the responsibility for a critical milestone on external contracts. And so for us, it's trial by fire. We get to see how the candidate is able to handle the kind of pressure associated with a deliverable milestone, because in our case, we're not a university, we're a commercial company, and if we don't perform successfully on a milestone, we don't get paid. So, and of course, we don't simply throw the candidate to the wolves and say, good luck, please get this milestone complete by the due date. Giving someone responsibility doesn't mean at all that they are solely responsible for it, and so, but it gives, it provides them with, we'll say, focus. And so why should you consider an industrial postdoc? What's in it for you? You'll get your first real exposure to industrial culture, and I would refer to that as try before you buy. It may be that you'd like to consider a career doing research in an industrial setting. Perhaps you're not sure, perhaps that some of these other benefits will appeal to you, but in any case, the level of the commitment that you have made to the company is lower, as you'll see, as a postdoc than if you were a regular full-time employee, and I think that brings some advantages with it. You're going to experience an extremely strong, high level of multidisciplinarity that you're very likely not used to. Although this is a standard in industrial R&D, multidisciplinarity in academia is more talked about than actually observed, and I'll give you an example. On my team, the way you can tell whether or not you're really doing multidisciplinary research is by looking who the co-authors on your papers are. And in our case, in just the photonics research that we've done in my group, we've had physicists, computer scientists and engineers, material scientists, electrical engineers, including circuit designers, folks who are experts at interfacing with VLSI fabs, computer architects, and we just added a chemist and a fab technician to a publication that we sent out recently. And so that kind of multidisciplinarity, I think, is remarkable. I believe, will actually be publishing a paper with a few programmers and software engineers over the next year, and I think you'd be very hard-pressed to get that level of experience in a university setting, at least at that depth. I think it's useful to understand how industry makes decisions. It can seem very opaque and very frustrating when you're outside the company, particularly when you're looking for a collaboration or financial backing from a large company. And so once you're on the inside, you begin to see how those decisions get made. It's a far from imperfect process, but it is at least comprehensible and I think instructive. You will have access to state-of-the-art equipment. It is remarkable both for research, for manufacturing. It is equipment that is the very best that money can buy, and it's particularly in the lab and characterization labs, and so it saves you an enormous amount of time. It significantly increases the power of the measurements and the fabrication that you can do, and so it will really allow you to hone your skills at a very serious and I think attractive level. One thing that's really cool about being a postdoc is you have very limited bureaucratic responsibilities. You don't have to go to staff meetings. You are not asked to help filling out forms. Believe me, there's a reasonable, I won't say unreasonable, there's a pretty reasonable amount of bureaucratic stuff I have to do that my postdocs never have to even get close to. One thing that I think is very attractive, particularly if you're a postdoc for 2 or 3 years in industry, there's never a requirement for you to write a proposal. The money is already there, and the task is usually in front of you. And so you get to focus completely on the work. Between the limited bureaucratic responsibilities and no requirements to write proposals and very competitive pay, it's almost like we're spoiling you. The pay can be as high as 2 to 3 times what you would ordinarily receive from a university postdoc. And so it isn't quite as high as an entry-level position, but usually when you move from a postdoc to an entry-level position, you're going to go in at to your first regular full-time job. Particularly working for me, you'll generally come in at a higher level than you would have just off the street, and the raise you get as you're converted from a postdoc to a regular employee tends to be and so it's worth keeping in mind. I think that having an opportunity to file patent applications and understanding the strategy behind filing patent applications as opposed to maintaining trade secrets or just publishing papers or doing some combination of filing patent applications and publishing, seeing how that is done and going through the process of working with an attorney to write a high-quality patent application, it's quite a bit different from writing a paper. It's, I think, something that is quite useful. You can occasionally get that opportunity in an academic setting. You should assume that you will have an opportunity to do it in an industrial setting, and I think it's very rewarding. And last but not least, the industry contacts that you can make during an industrial postdoc tend to be extremely high quality. Not simply the people that you have worked directly with, but because it's a very multidisciplinary setting, you can get to meet some middle management, if you're lucky, maybe even an executive. And if you choose to go back to academia, you carry those industrial contacts back with you. You will be able to rely on those as you go forward in a way that I think is very helpful. I have some of my postdocs that have returned to academia. I've been able to write letters of support. I've been able to collaborate with them, and I think that's helped them as they sought funding to relaunch their academic careers. So now, what's the downside, though? Why should you not do it? And this is very important for you to understand. Although it may seem to you when you're 30 years old or so that if you make a mistake, it's going to be fatal. You could really ruin your career. When you are young, it's very hard to make a truly tragic error that sets your career back significantly. In an industrial postdoc, even if it turns out that research choice isn't perfect for you, I still believe that those benefits on the previous page apply, and you will still grow from that experience. And then you'll, in fact, in many ways, that experience will help you at the next stage of your career. But nevertheless, it's important for you to go into a quest for an industrial postdoc with your eyes wide open. And so you really do need to understand something about the group that you're going to be working in, because the value of the experience that you're going to have is highly dependent on boundary conditions, like what industry are you in. There's a difference between, for example, information technology and biology or big pharma, and so understanding how postdoc experiences might differ from one industry to another is key. There is a corporate culture. There's going to be a difference between a small company, which generally will not hire postdocs, medium-sized companies who might, and large companies who do. And understanding the difference between, we'll say, Oracle, HP, and Intel is very important, and it should be one of the considerations when you're trying to choose that postdoc opportunity. And finally, your boss. I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to explain at the very end of this, if I have time, how I think about my role and the kind of environment I like to create with my group. And so you have to talk to the people who work for the boss you're considering and make sure that they think he or she is going to be ideal for you, and that you'll just have to be pushy and ask some questions. It is rare. I have done basic research in my group at HP and now Hewlett Packard Enterprise, but applied research is the norm, if not advanced development. You will be closer to product than you might be in academia, but it's unrealistic in most cases to think that you'll have an opportunity to do truly basic research in an industrial postdoc. You're going to have limited access to proprietary information. That means occasionally there might be a meeting that you'd like to go to, but you're not going to be invited because for example, I might be talking to one of our partners in one of our business units who are going to explain to me what they need in a way that will reveal part of their proprietary strategy into a postdoc. They become a little more closed, and so as a result, an industrial setting may occasionally seem much more closed compared to academia. There will be things that you won't have access to. You will find that, for example, external collaborations can be fairly heavily constrained. You might think, hey, it would be awesome if I could go talk to this university group about the research that I'm doing, what I just found, but you may find that for intellectual property considerations, your boss, someone like me, will say, you know what, I think that we're going to have to forego that opportunity and push on ourselves for a bit longer. Something that can be a little bit unnerving. Projects can be canceled. In fact, I have canceled a couple. I'm not a professor. I am not inclined to ride a horse until it dies under me. And so what that means is that occasionally if I believe that we aren't making the kind of progress that we should be making, I'll give you a concrete example of this in just a minute and what the outcome was, then I may decide that the project should not continue. And sometimes I get to decide and sometimes I don't get to decide, but that's one of the risks that you take. Publications, you generally have to think very hard about whether or not you want to continue to publish. I think that it's critical, and in fact, if you take external funding, like I do from DARPA and other organizations, publication is a critical part of the reporting mechanism and of the advertising for the next contract that you try to get. But nevertheless, in industry, a managerial approval process is common. So asking permission to publish, which is something that essentially is unheard of in academia, and occasionally causes a bit of a collision between industry and academia when they're collaborating. Conference attendance can be subject to some corporate constraints. Budget is one of them. Exposure is another. I have generally not had any trouble publishing. I have generally always been able to send a postdoc to at least 1 or 2 critical conferences a year, particularly if they are going to be presenting a result using funding from the external contracts that the postdocs are working on. But it's important for you to understand what the publication policy is and whether or not that matters to you at a postdoc. And so now, let's talk about myths, and frankly, there's really only one myth, and that is industrial postdocs can't return to academia. But industry recognizes the value of research, and so industry doesn't want to foreclose the possibility that a postdoc could return to academia. And many universities seek to commercialize research. In fact, sometimes it just drives me crazy. I keep colliding with the tech transfer office at a number of universities when all I'm really trying to do is just support a graduate student. And occasionally, many professors launch startups, and they have safety and tenure. And so it seems like a really good idea because they already have a job and they're not necessarily putting that job at risk. They can always return to academia. And so really, what is the relationship between industry and academia, and what kind of an impact is it going to have on your career if you choose to go back to academia? Let me give you an example. So this is an example of an experiment that we did as part of a DARPA contract. And Andre Farron did a lot of really excellent work on diamond nanophotonic device with the intention of ultimately being able to do quantum computation, quantum information processing on an all-diamond substrate. And the work that I'm showing you here is the first paper that we published. It ended up on the cover of Nature Photonics, and so that should show you that my group, at least, is serious about publishing. But that's one of the easiest ways for you to find out how a particular corporation or a group feels about publishing. Look for their publications. So in this case, Andre made a diamond microring resonator. The one on the lower left there is only 3 microns in diameter. It had a Q of about 5,000 or 6,000, and the goal was to significantly increase the rate at which a nitrogen vacancy color center in that diamond microring radiated into a particular preferred axial mode of the cavity. And without going into the details of that, the point is that it was an extremely academic, basic research kind of project. Andre later improved it. Ordinarily, a diamond nitrogen vacancy color center will emit 3% of its light into a narrow spectral feature called the zero phonon line. This work increased that to 25%, and later Andre got the number up to 70% with a photonic bandgap crystal cavity that he built in my group. And so if you look at the authors of Andre's paper, Andre Farron, I'll leave Andre last. So there's me at the end, Kai-Mei Fu. She is a professor at the University of Washington. Charles Santori was originally my postdoc, and then I hired him as a full-time staff member, and he's now at one of the Google Alphabet Soup. Paul Barkley is a professor at the University of Calgary, and Andre is a professor at Caltech. And one of the most important things to realize here is not simply that it is possible, if I know that what your goal is, I can make sure that the experience that I provide for you is vectored towards allowing you to launch a tenure track career at a university. It's that in this case, I canceled this project. We got to the end of the DARPA contract, and I realized that we were essentially just competing with universities. We were taking money from DARPA, we were doing single device work, and what I felt was appropriate for an industrial research group to do was to in fact try to build circuits, scaled up significantly the number of devices, and it just wasn't possible to do with the diamond materials we had available at the time. And then over a few objections, I said, look, we are not doing what we really should be doing with the nation's tax dollars. And so what I ended up doing with this project is I divided it into 2.5 pieces, and I offered those pieces to Andre, to Kai-Mei, and to Paul. And so in fact, we worked out an agreement where they could continue to work in my lab, in my fabrication facility, even after they went onto their industrial jobs. We collaborated for a while. I told them if the diamond material situation ever improved, then I might want to get back into the field, but I would call them first. But the point is that even though we canceled the project, the work continued because my postdocs carried it with them into their the next stage of their careers, their academic careers. And so the inability to return to academia after an industrial postdoc is just completely a myth, at the very least in my group. And so this is my team with spouses and you can see some future interns there. But this, about half of those people, closer to 2/3 of those folks work for me. And of them, I'd say 3 of the folks who work for me here, 3/4 are permanent employees, the other are postdocs, and 1 intern. And of the permanent employees, in this picture, only 2 of them started as a full-time regular employee. All of the others came to me as a postdoc. And one of the 2 people who I hired directly without a postdoc had worked with my group for a few years as an intern from Texas A&M. So we have, I have a very strong belief in the industrial postdoc system. I think it's an excellent way to build a very strong group. I have terrific relationships with a number of universities, so for me, the industrial postdoc has been a boon. And I've done my best to make the most of it and the most of the careers of the people who have, well, trusted me with their careers. I've tried to do my best for them. And so as an example of the sort of expectations you should set when you are looking for a postdoc job and you're trying to suss out whether or not your boss is in fact aligned with your career goals, I'm going to give you an example of what I tell my postdoc candidates. And so this might trigger some questions when you go in for a university. So I tell people to think big. You should think as big as your company. Right now, HPE is a $40 billion company. We have products all across the information technology industry, and I encourage my postdocs to understand something about those product lines, the markets that we are trying to address, and to see if there are adjacencies to our current projects that we could suggest to our business unit partners so that they can begin to interact to the extent that it's possible with folks in our business units. This is a very important piece of advice. Always keep your head. There are occasionally traumatic things that can happen in industrial settings. Relax. Chaos often leads to opportunity. There are a lot of people around you running around with their hands in the air. Keep your head, and you'll see an opportunity to have an impact. It's in stressful situations like that that the real opportunities become clearer. You should really do any job needed to make your project work, and so there aren't jobs just for technicians and just for programmers and just for postdocs and just for bosses. Whatever needs to be done, you should be willing to do it. And sometimes that means that I have to give a postdoc a bit more responsibility. I have brought postdocs with me to DARPA PI meetings and asked them to present a slide. It often makes them nervous, but I think it's very good for them also to see how those DARPA meetings actually work. This is more of a piece of advice for once you have been hired full-time, but to a certain extent it applies as a postdoc. If you look at the entry-level people who had jobs as postdocs before, look at what they do and learn to do that job. In other words, set yourself up for success by making sure that before you're promoted, you're already doing the job. In all of the promotion materials that I've submitted over the last decade for people who work for me, that's often been the very first sentence in the promotion packet. This person is already doing the job. I believe that it's important to build the best possible team. That means hiring people smarter than me, which as I get older for some reason is getting easier and easier, and then trust them. You have to trust your team. Do not second guess them. I don't believe in acutely hands-on management. It's important that you give people the opportunity to fail, but then help them avoid it. But show them that you trust them to do their jobs. I believe in sharing credit wisely, and so I have, very often you will see in a paper published in an academic setting that for example, on the paper, the contact for the paper is generally the professor. On the papers that we publish, I allow the postdoc who is the first author to fully take the credit, and their email address is the one given out as the person you should contact if you want more information. In industry, you have to come to work each day willing to be fired. It means you have to be willing to do the right thing. And as a result, especially if you're working for me, don't be afraid to ask for forgiveness and not permission. So these are the guidelines that it usually takes me 3 to 5 years to fully bake these into the folks who work for me. But this gives you an idea of the kind of team that I want to build, and it gives you an idea of what sort of questions you might want to ask when you're considering a job as a postdoc. Thanks very much for your attention. I'd be happy to take your questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ray, for the wonderful presentation. And we've got a lot of great questions coming in. I think one thing I'm going to kick off the discussion with is just to comment kind of what we had talked about earlier about just many of you, in my job at APS, I talk about career statistics, and the majority of physics PhDs are actually going to be in the private sector. I mean, they're going to be working in the private sector, and a lot of faculty really mean well and want to help advise students about industry jobs, but they themselves don't have any experience in these kind of environments. And so to your comments, Ray, about the likelihood of sort of, doing an industry postdoc and then going back to sort of the academic track, I would argue, and I think many faculty would agree, that actually coming in, having had experience in industry would be a tremendous boon for you. So that's just a comment I want to make. Anything you want to add?
Thank you. No, I think that when I look at what Andre, Kaimei, Paul, Jingjing, the list goes on and on, as they've gone back to academia, there's after having worked for me, there's a level of maturity they can bring to their interactions with the government. And this is one of the reasons I bring them to the DARPA PI meetings, because they can see how I interact with the DARPA program managers. And I think that's very helpful. And so depending on the group, I think it really ideally, it broadens your horizons in an extremely productive way. I think that's the easiest way to say it.
Yep, I agree. Okay, great. So moving on to questions, there's a whole slew of questions. Luckily, they're all basically the same question, which is, how do I find these opportunities? And a related question to that is, what would make one a strong candidate? What kind of resume? What kind of recommendation? How does that whole process of finding and applying for these positions work? How does that work?
Actually, that is a fantastic question. Every large company has a jobs website. And that's one way to do it. But another way to do it is you will go to conferences and you will see people from industry giving plenary addresses, okay? You walk up and you introduce yourself, you hand them a business card, as silly as that sounds. Hand them a business card and say, I would love to know whether or not you hire, you're working in a field related to mine. Do you hire postdocs? Do you have any other jobs available? I think it's, you can troll jobs websites, but usually I'm actually, my team says that I'm shameless, because when I give a big address at a conference, I tell, I'm not at all shy about telling people in the audience that if they have any really amazing students, they should send them my way. So making a connection, finding a connection, you will very rarely, if you look in the back of Physics Today, will you see an offer for an industrial postdoc. We don't do it. We have done it for, I think, computer architecture jobs and IEEE, but that just isn't the way we reach people. We reach people by giving talks, posting jobs on websites. I've met quite a few graduate students at DARPA meetings, so making that initial connection can be a little tough, but it requires persistence. Now, about the, what is the best way to prepare yourself to make a good impression? Let me describe our process and then offer advice based on that process. I can't guarantee you that everybody does it this way, but we usually will have an announcement go out on our jobs website. We will begin making announcements at, the people who work for me who are full-time. When they give talks, they'll announce that we're looking for a postdoc. I have in the past sent emails to professors at universities where I found postdocs before. So, we have all those fishing lines out. But then what we do as the applications start coming in, one of the very first things that we look for is in the resume, the very first thing that we look for is the opposite of what you might naively expect. We are not all that interested in the classes you took. We are not necessarily interested in a list of your skills because, frankly, anybody can put down that they know how to program in C++. The thing that for us ultimately is going to make a big difference is, have you gone to a conference? Have you published a paper? Have you been a first author? Who are your references who can vouch for you? And what is it that you think is the most important outcome of your graduate student career? What did you really ultimately decide that you were going to focus on, and why? What was it that made the big difference? And what is the impact you think it ultimately can have? And so when we look at those resumes in that context, and we ignore the courses, we ignore the GPA, we ignore the, we really don't pay that much attention to it. In the end, for us, it's the publications, the conference, and then some indication that you have an appreciation for what was important about what you did and what was novel about the way you went about solving the problem that you chose. And we'll typically then move to telephone interviews, and we'll do 15 of them for a given position. So we'll start out with an application batch of about 50 people, usually, for a postdoc. We will then phone interview on the order of a third of them. And the phone interview, and it's painful because it's an hour. And I try to coach people to try to talk only for 30 minutes. Now I say that because I know that they'll talk for 40, and 40 is about the right number. But I also say don't list everything that you ever did, especially the stuff you did when you were starting out, when you didn't really know what you were doing and you were helping a more senior graduate student, learning how to work in the lab. Tell us about the work that is central to your PhD thesis. Tell us about specifically what you did. Tell us what other folks did and how you collaborated with them. Tell us what you think about the range of applications of the work that you've done. And it's amazing because out of those 15 interviews, maybe 5 people will follow that advice. It's really very interesting. Now that doesn't necessarily disqualify the other 10, it just makes it a little harder for us. I mean, usually out of 15 candidates, 3 or 4 of them will talk for 60 minutes, and it's kind of hard to work with that. And right. So, because they're afraid that they will leave out some grain of accomplishment, and so then finally, it's out of those 15, we'll pick 3, and bring them in for a formal interview. And so at that point, we're very serious. And in my group, you do not have to wear a tie when you come for your interview. You should wear shoes. I had one candidate from Stanford once who wore sandals. And that's okay when you're talking to me, but if at the time, if you were talking to my boss, that would have been a little awkward. But the most important thing, though, is to amplify what you what it was that you thought was most important about your work and what it was that you actually did. And you'll go through, 4 or 5 technical interviews for half an hour apiece with somebody who's going to ask you a question or two about your work, and you should answer it at an appropriate level of depth that shows true mastery. And then based on the follow-up question you might get from the person in that interview, you should maybe ask a question yourself.
Yeah.
Engage the person in a real discussion of these technical results. And if they ask a question you don't understand, you say, could you try that again? I don't quite understand it. This isn't your thesis exam. What you're really trying to do here is find out how well you would fit into this group. And if you get a sour vibe because the questions they're asking you are kind of obnoxious or they look like they're trying to trip you up, the work environment is very likely to be very similar.
Right, yeah.
So if you're having a really constructive, interesting conversation with the folks that are interviewing you, then that's how they work, and then you know that this is a place that you would find attractive.
Right. So in a certain sense, you're kind of using the interview as an opportunity to sort of learn something yourself about the company. Peter Fisk, who does some workshops for us, says, your interview, they're learning about you, but you're actually interviewing them too a little bit.
Oh, absolutely, and especially when you'll end up talking to someone like me who is usually the PI of the program that you're getting hired to work on as a postdoc. And when I say, do you have any questions for me? Usually my part of the interview, everybody else is half an hour, mine's 45 minutes. That can be a really long 45 minutes if you don't have any questions for the guy who's ultimately going to be your boss. So think really hard about, how sometimes I get really great questions. What if you have disputes about author order? What, tell me about the last person who quit working for you and why. These are really great questions. Right? So, so a person, I want a person who's going to engage me and try to make sure that at least as an initial condition, the environment that I have created here is something that they think they'd be excited about, and the team of people that they've talked to all day is a team they'd be excited to work with.
Right. Yes, and speaking of questions, there are loads flooding in, so I'd like to shift gears a little bit and also ask a question. Multiple people have asked. I'm gonna combine these questions. So lots of people have asked about the usefulness of having a theory background in industry and in your company, A, so that's sort of question A, are there roles for people with theory backgrounds? And B, also about different subfields. I had somebody who was a nuclear physicist and someone who specializes in fluid dynamics. And I mean, obviously, I presume condensed matter backgrounds are pretty useful. Can you speak to, first of all, roles for theorists, and secondly, if there are any particular subfields that would be more competitive?
I'm going to take the second question first. There aren't less competitive subfields. There are best suited subfields. And so the fields I wrote down earlier, so so someone with an elementary particle physics or nuclear physics background who submits an application to my group is probably running at a disadvantage, and I'm just being honest about this, because I want I know people who get a PhD in physics in this era, they're smart. They're clearly smart. What I'm looking for, though, is someone who's going to be able to contribute and isn't going to have to start from scratch. And so and that may seem unfair, but I think it's especially critical in a postdoc, because I think a postdoc's 2 or 3 years, on my team at least, should be extremely productive. And if they have to spend a year and a half learning a new field, it's going to be tough, in particular because it's the rest of my team that's going to be teaching them. And so that's going to slow us down. And so I don't think that there are less competitive subfields, period. I think there are better matches in some industries than others for particular subfields. But I hire from about 7 or 8 different subfields of science and engineering, and I think it speaks to that multidisciplinarity. The first question, yes, there are roles for theorists. Those will ebb and flow in industry, but it is what you will often. So I run a hardware group. However, there have been folks who have found postdocs who are theorists who had at least some expertise in software that made it possible for them to access, for example, deep learning and big data type of projects in information technology companies. And in fact, there's quite a bit of pull from big data and deep learning companies now, at least in Silicon Valley, for people with a theory Ph.D., but I don't know about postdoc prospects in those fields. If you can, if you think that you're a theorist in elementary particles, but you find deep learning interesting, there are online classes like at Coursera. I've taken one. I thought it was awesome. And it's a really fast way. If you just close the door, you can probably finish the whole class in a week, and will allow you to run up a ladder pretty quickly. So there are ways to educate yourself and make yourself more attractive in the very short term, I think, thanks to online classes.
Okay, very good. Some other questions have to do with sort of characteristics of these postdocs in industry. So, for example, there are several questions, but you can maybe speak to all of them. One person asked sort of how long do they typically last? Another person asked, are there benefits associated with them, including if you are an international student, would a company be willing to handle manage visas on behalf of the postdoc?
Those are great questions. When we hire international students, for postdocs, we relocate them, and we also handle the visa process. But for a postdoc, we generally don't pay for green cards. And so that usually happens once they become a permanent employee. Regular full-time employee will upgrade them to a green card, but for the most part, what do we need to get an H-1B? Is it possible to use a J-1? To be honest with you, it drives me crazy, but we always do it. So we make sure the student isn't just floating around trying to figure out how to get a visa so they can go get their new job. We think it's part of our responsibility. And so I cannot speak for all companies. Our postdocs have health care, all the benefits, except they do not get full participation in the company 401k plan. And so you don't get a retirement plan, but everything else you get. That'll vary from company to company. And so will for all I know, there are companies that will get postdocs green cards, but I'm just saying that you should have a reasonable expectation that you will get for example, health insurance and visa assistance. So that's part and parcel of getting a real job, I think.
Right, absolutely. And also, and so, sorry, how long, maybe I missed it, how long are typically?
No. So I would say nominally, we usually sign the documents for 2 years.
Okay.
But I extended one postdoc originally. My record shortest is 6 months.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and the record longest was 4¼ years. So it is something that you have to play by ear. So sometimes someone just does not work out, and you made a mistake. You both made a mistake, and it's time to let's say tie it off. But then in another
Right.
case, I had a postdoc who, after 2½ years, told me that he actually wanted to go back to academia, and I'd been vectoring him for an internal hire, and I didn't think his publication record was good enough to get a tenure track job, and so I had to kind of reorient him towards part of the project that I thought would result in higher profile publications. So another way to say this is that you really have got to figure out whether or not your boss is going to consider it his or her personal responsibility to make sure you have a quality experience, and
right.
whether or not they are interested in what's going to happen to you after your career. It's fun, I suppose, to hear about tough love and how you show up here and I'm just going to walk you to the end of the dock and drop you in the lake, and you'll either learn to swim or you'll drown. I think it's deplorable. So I have never done it that way, but some corporate cultures, that may be the way they operate, and if that's something that sounds appealing to you, go for it. But this is why, if you've got 45 minutes to talk to your future boss, your future possible boss, ask him questions that'll make it clear how he or she operates, because like I said earlier, it's unlikely you're going to make a terrible mistake and really set your career back, but you could make yourself miserable.
Right, absolutely.
So you should try to avoid that.
Absolutely. And also, just sort of comparing and contrasting, you were talking about the benefits and what is included and what isn't included. Let's talk for a minute about another kind of characteristic of these, and maybe compare and contrast with what a postdoc in academia might be. For example, are the sort of benefits comparable, or are they better in industry? And I think another question many people are wondering, and I know you can't give specific numbers, but can you talk about salaries for these industry postdoc positions as opposed to what their equivalent would be in an academic environment?
I can give you relative. You will. The lowest I ever paid a postdoc was twice the very best academic offer I have ever seen in my life. And typical, it's 2.5 to 3, but I can't give a specific number, or I'll get killed.
Right, of course. No, I understand. Okay, another question many people are asking is how frequently would you say your postdocs, or to your awareness in general, are industry postdocs actually promoted to positions in the company? Is that really common, or is, what percentage?
So I would say, of the people who have, this is incredibly dependent on the industry, the company, the boss. And I don't have good figures for the IT industry. But I will tell you that of the people who have told me they wanted to stay, every postdoc I hire, I sit down, take them to lunch within a month of their arrival, after they've sort of figured out where their badges are, and things like that. I take them out to lunch and I say, right now, give me your best guess for what your next career step is. And you can be completely wrong and you can change your mind in 3 months, I don't care, but starting now, I'm going to try to create an experience for you, an opportunity for you to achieve what you want. And of the people who have told me they wanted to stay, 90%. Sounds
oh, wow.
about right.
Okay. All right. Well, that is a That's a very high number, I think.
Yeah, but I don't. But I would be shocked if that was common. That's the way I operate. But this is again, this is a statistic that should be something that you should not be afraid to ask during your job interview. The statement you made earlier is absolutely critical. You are interviewing them, and so you're going to give them the most precious thing that you have: your time, your insights, your innovation, right? Your enthusiasm. They're going to give you money.
Right.
And so what you have is a lot more valuable than just money, and so you make sure that you're going to be spending that wisely.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, so a couple other questions that have been coming in. Two people asked about this. If you're an international student and you get your PhD sort of abroad, but you're interested in doing an industry postdoc in the U.S., does your previous advice differ in any way from,
No.
is there any particular advice? No?
No. I've hired two postdocs directly out of foreign universities, one from Ghent, one from Australia. I don't care. There are certain countries that it is difficult to hire a postdoc from. I will be frank about that. But it is not something that it doesn't give us pause at all. So someone coming from a foreign university, if they have the right characteristics, then we just treat them exactly as we would treat a U.S. citizen working who got his or her degree at a foreign university, or an international student who got his or her degree at a U.S. university. I don't care.
Okay. All right. Very good. Okay. So also, relating to the process of actually getting hired, how far in advance of actually completing one's PhD would you recommend that people start applying or looking for these kinds of positions? Like, what would be kind of a maximum gap or lead time you guys would be able to accommodate?
Usually, if you are further away than 6 months, then there are enough uncertainties involved so when we hire someone, we want them to start reasonably soon, within a month or two. I have hired someone before they have before they've actually received their degree. I generally do not. I did once, and it worked out. But what you will find is that most companies will have a difficult time making you an offer if you haven't at least passed your defense. Once that's happened, it's generally a lot of form signing and rubber stamping to get the degree. But you don't actually have to have a shiny new PhD degree in your hands when you show up to work. I would never hire someone who hadn't finished their thesis, period. I just will not do it, right? And so, and I don't think anybody would. But around the time, so I'd actually like to propose something else. When you think you've got about 2 years left, boy, look for internships. The rate at which I convert interns into postdocs is very high. And so, a summer internship, and when you're a grad student, it doesn't have to be in the summer, but look for internships. There are tons of companies that will take students, grad students, for 3 months, and that is the ultimate try before you buy. We relocate, we pay really well, and then we send you back, and there are complications. You will, in fact, I don't even want to get into the complications because the complications are all bureaucratic. But the point is that even before you think about becoming a postdoc, try to get an internship, because a lot of the questions that I am being asked now about what's it like are answered by just spending 3 months working at a company. You'll have a really good idea. Depending on the internship you get. But starting 2 years before you get out, look for an internship. Starting 6 months before you graduate, start looking very seriously for job announcements and job opportunities. So right around the time you're 6 months from being finished, that should be when you're looking on jobs websites, you're passing out your business card, you are trying to find places to interview, because as fast as we like to think we are, it usually takes us 2 months just to gather names and get to the phone interview stage.
Right. Great. Okay, so before we proceed, this is actually all the time we have for the official webinar, but we apologize if we didn't get to your question. And if your schedule permits, we will allow whoever wants to hang out and maybe answer a few additional questions. There's some more really, really good ones here. But if you have to sign off now, this is the official end of our webinar. You can also follow up by sending an email to webinars@aps.org. And as I said at the beginning, some of you asked about the slides. Yes, they will be posted on the webinar homepage, as will a link to the recording of today's video. And also, if you registered, you will get an email containing the link to the video in about 24 hours. And if you are signing off, in order to help us continue to develop our quality webinar presentations, please help us by taking a moment to complete the short survey as you exit the webinar today. Okay, now to dive back into a few additional questions, Ray, if you have a minute.
I certainly do.
Good? Okay, fantastic. So someone asked a very interesting question earlier. What if at the end of you kind of hinted at when it's not a good fit, and I imagine there's a kind of a middle ground. What if at the end of your postdoc you feel good about it, but for whatever reason you don't get hired into the company? I mean, does that happen very often? I guess your question earlier, your answer, 90% who say they want to stay. I mean, are there any who say they want to stay, but you're...
Yeah, I mean, that happens. Things change, all right? And so projects change, the importance of a project in a company may change. Your boss may change. I could get fired. That's one of the remarkable things about industry. Your professor will never get fired, but I can. And so you could start your PhD under boss A, who you thought the world of, and then end up under boss B, who's Captain Bligh. So there's no way to know for sure exactly how that's going to turn out. You may feel that you did a fantastic job. But industry is no different than academia in that respect. You may feel that after you've done a postdoc at a university and you've sent out your applications to tenure track positions and you don't end up with a tenure track position and it's time to hit it for another postdoc, you may feel that you were treated poorly. And so somebody who I terminate after 6 or 9 months because I don't think it's working out, it's never because they're just terrible people or doing a terrible job. It's that I can tell that this isn't the right career opportunity for them, and we think we need to make a change because the best direction for this person to go in, direction we need to go in, are different. And so there is, and I think it's just human nature. You apply for a job and you really want the job and you don't get it, and you think that somehow someone has decided that you're not good enough, and that is almost never true. By the time we get to the phone interview stage, for sure, we are looking at really quality people, and we are trying to understand whether or not they will really rise to the occasion and be able to perform. And that will involve sometimes esoteric things like, after we got a chance to talk to him or her, is the skill set really a good match? There should be a little bit of overlap with what we already have, but there should be some really new skills being brought in. Can they collaborate well? There have been, 4 or 5 times when I've just absolutely flatly said no to my team. I am not going to hire this person, even though he or she is obviously going to be a superstar. because they're prima donnas, or they prefer to work alone, or they're going to be, and I have to act as the manager, and if I think someone's going to be a management headache, then I'm lazy, and so I say, no, I'm not going to hire this person, so I'm not perfect. So,
oh, no.
so the point is, I think,
go ahead.
The key point here is that when you can't let applying for a job, whether it's applying for a postdoc or trying to get in. You remember some of you may have applied to go to a particular graduate school and they didn't accept you, but there were other opportunities and you were able to take advantage of them. I will admit, and that may be tough, but this is what life is all about, and sometimes the reasons are arbitrary, but sometimes, as in our case, we try to be very, very careful, because we know that these are people's lives and we have to treat them with respect. And so if you believe that you have done an outstanding job in your postdoc and I don't hire you, or whoever your boss is doesn't hire you, it's not a reflection on your quality as a person or a researcher or even your potential. It is a judgment that is being made by the person with the responsibility and the authority to hire, that you're not the best match for the job at that time, either of the job or your career. And it is easy to take something like that personally, but I strongly advise you not to do that, because there's always going to be another opportunity, particularly for the sorts of people who I think are graduating with physics PhDs in this era.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. I've heard other hiring managers say that they hire for attitude, and because they believe that a lot of the skills and knowledge can be trained. You can always teach someone something new, but you can't teach them to be, able to work well with others, or have a good attitude, or all the things that you might be looking for. So yeah, I've heard similar things. So another question is there a particular time frame in which you are hiring? I mean, is there a time when people should be looking for these, or are these opportunities kind of happening all throughout the year?
They tend to, for the postdocs, they tend to happen around the year, although I want to be really careful here. So let me take one step back. Internships, we tend to fill before Christmas. And I think most companies do, because even though I tell you can have an internship as a graduate student anytime, we tend to budget for them at the beginning of a fiscal year, but before the end of the first quarter. For us, the fiscal year starts in November. We have a budget, and we usually make a decision over the next 6 weeks about which interns we're going to hire. And so even if that internship isn't going to be strictly for the summer, it's a funding cycle thing that's internal. And I think most companies are like that. For a postdoc, if it's DARPA, the DARPA funding cycle means we would probably be looking in the summer, late spring, summer, for a postdoc that will start in the fall. And so I would say, but I'd actually have to think, but let's just say routinely, if it's a DARPA program, the BAAs tend to come out in the fall. The proposals are usually due usually some horrible day like December 26. The decisions are made in the winter. You have to negotiate contracts, and that always takes a few months, if not longer, depending on the skill of the government contract officer. And so we usually start interviewing when we are confident we're going to be able to sign the contract, and that typically seems to be around summer. But if it's a different funding agency like the Department of Energy, that's totally random.
Right. Okay. So it varies. A couple of questions. Maybe we'll have one more. Sadly, folks, I know that you all have great questions, but it's all the time we have. One more question. There have been several people asking about publishing practices in academia industry. We know that in academia, publish, publish, publish. That's very common.
Right.
So how frequently would you say, projects do get published, and for your typical sort of postdoc in industry, yeah, what would be typical? How would that, how many publications would that person expect to be able to produce?
I would say if I just look at, again, if I just look at my postdocs, so what you've done is you've asked someone to give a presentation based on his experience hiring and caring for and feeding postdocs, but I'm not an authority about it across industry, even across the IT industry. But I would say that if you are being hired as a postdoc to work on an internally funded project, you could reasonably expect to publish once or twice over your 2-year postdoc, because there isn't going to be a compulsion to publish on an internally funded project. If you're being hired to work on a government contract, I would expect you could publish at least 2 good papers a year.
Okay.
For 2 or 3 years, and that's historically been what I have seen in my group. We have almost always hired a postdoc to work on an externally funded project, though. We have, I usually, if we have an internally funded project or a project that's a bit sensitive, where we run into ITAR kinds of constraints, I usually just have regular employees work on that. But,
can you define ITAR?
Yeah, I forget what it stands for, but basically the U.S. government places export control constraints on companies, and so when you hire foreign nationals, you can be constrained in, to boil it down to something really absolutely straightforward. Basically, anybody on my team who is a foreign national, I do not let them work on projects that will lead solely to trade secrets. I only let them work on something that will be either filed as a patent application or published, because it is when something is withheld as a trade secret that the U.S. government starts to get nervous about foreign nationals working on projects that are deemed by the company to be so important that they aren't going to let anyone know what it is.
And for all of you for sticking around. And we're out of time again. So as I mentioned before, please fill out the survey as you exit, and we hope that you'll join us again soon. American Physical Society, copyright 2016, all rights reserved. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.